The day my parents handed my sister $4 million, they didn't even try to hide their disappointment in me. They made sure I felt it. My name is Ethan Miller, 31 years old. Clean-shaven, calm by nature, but forged by years of quiet humiliation. And that night, sitting at my parents' polished mahogany dining table, I realized something important. I was never their investment. I was their insurance policy. Rachel, my younger sister, sat glowing under the chandelier light, smiling as if she had just been crowned royalty. My father placed the documents in front of her with dramatic pride. $4 million, he announced. For your startup, for your future. Everyone clapped. Then he looked at me. And Ethan, he said, leaning back in his chair, you might want to learn something from your sister. She's building something real, not chasing whatever it is you do. A few relatives chuckled. I didn't react. I had built my consulting firm from nothing. No family money, no connections, no praise. But because I didn't flaunt it, because I didn't beg for validation, it didn't count. My mother added softly, you've always been different, Ethan. Not ambitious like Rachel. Different. That word had followed me my entire life. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just watched as my sister signed papers worth more than my parents had ever invested in me emotionally or financially. When dinner ended, Rachel cornered me near the staircase. Don't take it personally, she said sweetly. Dad just believes in me more. I studied her face. The confidence wasn't earned. It was inherited. I hope you succeed, I replied calmly. She smirked. I already have. That was the last peaceful night in that house. 3 weeks later, my phone rang. Unknown number. Mr. Miller? The voice asked. This is Charles Whitman, your father's attorney. We need to discuss something urgent. I felt my pulse steady instead of spike. Go on. There appears to be a structural issue with the recent asset transfer. Interesting. I suggest you contact your own counsel immediately, he continued. Time is critical. The line went dead. I stood in my apartment, staring at the city skyline outside my window. $4 million. Public humiliation. And now legal urgency. I didn't panic. I called my lawyer instead. Within 48 hours, the truth surfaced quietly. The $4M wasn't a gift. It was leveraged against family-held assets, including shares partially registered under my name shares I had inherited from my grandfather years ago. Shares my parents assumed I would never question. They hadn't needed my signature, but they had underestimated my awareness. My father had used corporate maneuvering to secure funding for Rachel's startup, assuming the silent son wouldn't notice the fine print. He forgot something. I read everything. By the end of that week, my attorney looked at me across the conference table and said, if her company fails, the collateral could trigger liquidation, and you legally control a significant percentage. I leaned back. So, I'm the safety net. Yes. I almost laughed. They called me a failure. Yet when everything collapses, I'm the only one standing between them and financial ruin. I didn't confront them. I didn't warn Rachel. I let her launch party proceed. I let her post glamorous photos. I let my parents brag publicly. Because revenge isn't loud, it's patient. And something in the market shifted quietly 2 months later. Her projections were inflated. Her risk model was flawed. Her burn rate was unsustainable. The first investor pulled out, then another. Then came the audit. And that's when my father's lawyer called again. This time, the tone was different, desperate. The second call from my father's lawyer came at 7:12 a.m. Too early for confidence, too early for control. Mr. Miller, Charles Whitman said, his voice noticeably strained. We need to meet. Immediately. I didn't rush. I poured coffee first, sat by the window, watched the city wake up. Only then did I reply. Send the address. Rachel's startup had officially entered what investors politely call distress, which really means the numbers don't lie anymore. Her burn rate was catastrophic. Marketing, overspending, inflated hiring. Contracts signed based on projections that were more fantasy than strategy. But here's the part that made it poetic. The collateral backing her $4M funding? It was tied to a holding structure that included my inherited shares from our grandfather's estate. Shares my father quietly repositioned during the transfer. Shares he assumed I wouldn't track. He forgot I built my entire business on due diligence. When I entered the law office, both my parents were already there. Rachel wasn't. That told me everything. My father looked older, less polished. My mother avoided eye contact. Charles Whitman cleared his throat. There is a potential liquidity event pending, he began carefully. If certain debt triggers are activated, asset protection becomes complicated. Complicated for who? I asked calmly. Silence. Then my father spoke. You knew. It wasn't a question. I read. I corrected him. My mother's voice trembled. Ethan, this isn't the time. No, I said evenly. This is exactly the time. Charles slid documents across the table. If Rachel's company failed to secure emergency funding within 30 days, the collateral structure would activate. Assets would freeze. Liquidation proceedings would begin. And because of the way the trust was structured, I had veto authority. My father leaned forward. We need you to sign a temporary restructuring waiver. There it was, the son they called a failure. Now the only firewall between them and collapse. I didn't touch the papers. What happens if I don't? I asked. Charles answered quietly. The holding company enters protection. Control shifts. To me, I finished. No one argued. I studied my father's face. This was the man who publicly compared me to my sister like I was a defective investment. Now he needed my signature, not my forgiveness. My signature. Where's Rachel? I asked. She's handling investor communications. My mother said quickly. Translation, she doesn't want to face me. Interesting. Over the next week, the cracks widened. Another investor exited. A supplier filed a payment complaint. Rachel's PR team quietly deleted promotional claims from their website. And still, no apology. No accountability. Only urgency. My father called me personally for the first time in months. Son? He began. I almost smiled. He hadn't called me that since I was 16. This isn't about ego, he continued. If this collapses, it affects everyone. You mean it affects Rachel? I replied. It affects the family. I let the silence stretch. Then I said something he wasn't expecting. Why didn't you believe in me like this? He didn't answer. Because the truth was simple. Rachel was flashy. I was disciplined. And discipline isn't exciting until it's the only thing left. Rachel finally showed up 3 days later. She came to my office. Not the family house. My office. Her designer confidence was gone. Her eyes were tired. You're enjoying this, she accused. No, I said honestly. I'm observing it. She paced. You could fix this. Yes. The word hit her harder than I expected. You won't? I didn't create it. Her voice cracked slightly. Dad said you've always been jealous. That almost made me laugh. Jealous of what? Being funded without accountability? She stopped pacing. For the first time in her life, Rachel looked uncertain. What do you want? She asked. Not forgiveness, not love, terms. And that was the moment I realized something profound. This wasn't revenge anymore. This was leverage. 30 days was ticking down. If the trigger activated, control would legally shift. Not loudly, not publicly, but permanently. My lawyer called me that evening. Ethan, if you take control, you could restructure everything. Or you could let it fall. I looked at the city lights again. They called me a failure, yet somehow, I'm the only one with options. And then the final investor pulled out. The countdown officially began. The trigger activated on a Tuesday. No explosion, no dramatic announcement. Just a quiet legal notification sent at 9:03 a.m. Default condition confirmed. Collateral enforcement pending. I was in my office when my lawyer called. It's official, Ethan. The holding structure has entered protection. You now control majority decision authority. I didn't celebrate. I just nodded. Begin phase 1, I said. Rachel's company announced temporary restructuring publicly that afternoon. The media framed it gently. Investors did not. By evening, financial blogs were dissecting her inflated projections. Anonymous sources questioned internal leadership decisions. A few industry analysts even hinted at familial interference in funding structures. That phrase made me pause. Familial interference. Accurate. My father called again. This time, no pride, no authority. "Ethan," he said quietly, "we need to talk face to face." "About control?" I asked. "About survival." Interesting word. We met at the family house, the same dining room where he handed Rachel $4 million and called me a failure. Now the room felt smaller. My mother looked exhausted. Rachel sat rigid, silent. I remained standing. "You let this happen," my father said, but there was no conviction behind it. "No," I replied calmly. "You structured it this way." He exhaled slowly. "What do you want?" There it was again. Not an apology, not reflection. Terms. I finally sat down. "I want governance restructuring," I said. "Full financial transparency. Removal of unilateral decision authority from you and Rachel." Rachel's head snapped up. "You can't be serious." "I am." "You dismantle Dad's position?" "No," I corrected. "I'm preventing collapse." Silence flooded the room because they knew I was right. The media pressure intensified over the next week. An internal email leak surfaced Rachel approving aggressive spending despite risk warnings from advisors. Public confidence dropped further. Suppliers demanded immediate payment guarantees. And through it all, I did nothing publicly. I didn't attack. I didn't expose. I simply allowed gravity to function. My lawyer finalized the enforcement documents. Control transfer wasn't loud. It was paperwork. And paperwork is colder than revenge. I signed the authorization, effective immediately. Operational authority shifted to a board structure when I chaired. Rachel lost executive control. My father lost financial override power. No shouting, no humiliation speech, just legal execution. That evening, Rachel came to see me again. But this time, she didn't accuse. She didn't posture. She looked shaken. "You took everything," she said quietly. "No," I replied. "I stabilized everything." Her voice trembled. "You could have warned us." "I did," I said calmly. "When I read the structure, when I asked questions, when I stayed silent and let you reconsider." She had no answer, because silence had been my warning. Publicly, the announcement came 2 days later. Leadership restructuring to ensure long-term stability. Corporate language for "you lost control." Financial blogs speculated about strategic oversight from a previously uninvolved stakeholder. That stakeholder was me, the failure. My father showed up at my office unannounced. He didn't sit. He didn't posture. "You planned this," he said quietly. "No," I answered honestly. "I prepared for it." He looked at me differently then, not as a disappointment, not as competition, but as something unfamiliar, equal. "You've changed," he admitted. I adapted. He nodded slowly. For the first time in my life, he didn't try to overpower me. But here's the truth they didn't realize yet. I wasn't finished. Control was step 1. Accountability was step 2. And step 2 was coming. Because during the audit process, something else surfaced. Something buried deeper than financial mismanagement. Something tied to the original transfer. And when my lawyer showed me the document, even I went silent. There had been a clause inserted. One my father never expected anyone to read closely. A contingency inheritance accelerator. If fiduciary misconduct could be proven, control wouldn't just shift temporarily. It would become permanent, irreversible. I closed the folder slowly. They called me a failure, but they never imagined I'd read the fine print. And now, the real decision wasn't whether I could save them. It was whether I should. I didn't sleep that night. The inheritance clause sat open on my desk, highlighted in clean yellow lines. In the event of fiduciary misconduct involving leveraged family assets, controlling interest shall permanently transfer to the protected beneficiary. Protected beneficiary, that was me. Grandfather had been meticulous. He had divided his estate unevenly but strategically. Rachel received liquid trust distributions over time. I received structural equity, quiet ownership, oversight authority, power disguised as nothing. And my father had triggered the very clause meant to prevent reckless control, not because he hated me, because he underestimated me. The audit team confirmed it within 72 hours. There had been procedural bypassing during the asset leverage process. Legal, but aggressive. questionable under fiduciary duty standards. In simpler terms, he gambled with assets he wasn't supposed to risk without unanimous consent, including mine. My lawyer leaned back in his chair. If you pursue this formally, Ethan, permanent control transfers. Your father loses executive authority indefinitely. I asked one question. Would it hold in court? Yes. That was enough. I scheduled a private meeting at the same law office where this all began. This time, there were no raised voices, no pride, no arrogance, just gravity. My father looked older than I remembered. My mother's hands trembled in her lap. Rachel avoided my eyes completely. I placed the inheritance clause copy on the table. My father didn't need to read it. He already knew. You're going to use it, he said quietly. I haven't decided, I replied. Rachel finally looked up. You destroyed Dad over this? Destroy. Interesting word. I'm not destroying anyone, I said calmly. I'm enforcing accountability. My father closed his eyes briefly. For years, he said slowly, I thought pushing you made you stronger. No, I replied. Ignoring me made me independent. Silence. He swallowed hard. You were never a failure, he admitted. I just didn't understand you. There it was, the sentence I should have wanted my entire life. And it landed empty, because respect given only under pressure isn't respect. It's survival instinct. The truth was simple. If I activated the clause fully, control would be permanent. Rachel would never regain executive authority. My father would never override decisions again. The empire would legally become mine, but so would the weight of it. And revenge, if held too tightly, becomes inheritance. That evening, I walked through the old family house alone. The same staircase where Rachel once smirked at me. The same dining room where $4 million were handed across the table like proof of worth. I stood in the center of the room. They called me a failure, but failure doesn't read contracts. Failure doesn't build contingency plans. Failure doesn't quietly wait for the law to do its job. My phone buzzed. It was my grandmother. I assume you've seen the clause, she said calmly. Yes, and I can end it, I told her, permanently. She paused. Then the real question isn't whether you can, she said softly. It's who you become after you do. That stayed with me, because control gained through revenge feels powerful. But control maintained through clarity feels permanent. The next morning, I made my decision. Not emotional, not impulsive, strategic. I filed enforcement, but with conditions. Permanent governance restructuring, independent oversight board, irrevocable removal of unilateral asset leverage rights. My father would remain involved, but never unchecked. Rachel could rebuild, but never alone. And ultimate equity control transferred to me, legally, irreversibly. When they received the finalized structure, no one argued, because they couldn't. The law wasn't emotional. It was precise. My father signed first. Rachel signed second. My mother cried quietly. I signed last, not as revenge, as correction. That night, I received one final message from my father. You didn't destroy us. You saved us from ourselves. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I replied with only one sentence. I protected what you were willing to risk, and I blocked the emotional part of myself that wanted more. Because closure isn't warmth, it's stability. But one final confrontation remained. Not legal, personal, and that would decide everything. Control doesn't feel loud. It feels quiet, heavy, permanent. The legal transfer finalized on a Friday morning. By afternoon, the new governance structure was public record. Financial analysts framed it as stabilizing leadership realignment. Corporate language for the son they dismissed now owns the future. But there was one final conversation left. Not about money, not about power, about truth. My father asked to meet alone. No lawyers, no Rachel, just us. We met at the old lake house neutral ground, a place where, years ago, he once tried to teach me how to be tougher. I arrived first. When he stepped out of his car, I noticed something immediately. He wasn't walking like a man in charge. He was walking like a man reckoning with consequences. We sat facing the water. Silence stretched between us. You won, he said finally. I shook my head. This wasn't a competition. It became one the day I compared you to your sister, he admitted. That surprised me. He rarely acknowledged specifics. I thought pushing you would make you stronger. He continued. Rachel needed support. You didn't. I let out a slow breath. You didn't support her, I said calmly. You protected her from accountability. He didn't argue, because now he understood the difference. For years, I wanted an apology, but sitting there, I realized something unsettling. Apologies don't restore time. They don't erase humiliation. They don't rebuild silent years of dismissal. They only acknowledge damage, and I had already rebuilt without him. You called me a failure, I said quietly. He looked down. I was wrong. It should have felt victorious. It didn't. It felt overdue. Rachel called later that evening. Her voice was different now. No arrogance. No entitlement. I'm stepping down, officially, she said. From everything. That's your decision, I replied. I never thought you'd actually take control. I didn't want control, I said. I wanted stability. She was quiet. Then she said something unexpected. I was scared of you. That almost made me laugh. You never showed it. I didn't need to, she whispered. Dad handled you for me. There it was. The truth. She never defeated me. She was shielded. And when the shield cracked, reality stepped in. Weeks passed. The company stabilized under the new structure. Spending corrected. Assets secured. Investors cautiously returned. I didn't celebrate. I executed. Meetings. Oversight. Long-term strategy. No spotlight. Just sustainability. Because revenge fades, but structure remains. My grandmother visited my office one afternoon. She stood by the window, looking out at the skyline. You chose control without cruelty, she said. I chose correction. She nodded. Then you've already won. The final family dinner happened a month later. Smaller. Quieter. No grand announcements. No comparisons. No $4 million speeches. My father spoke respectfully. Rachel listened more than she talked. My mother watched carefully, as if afraid the old might return. It didn't, because dynamics don't shift temporarily when power changes legally. They shift permanently. After dinner, my father stopped me near the door. You don't need us anymore, he said quietly. I met his eyes. I never needed permission, I replied. That was the difference. Not wealth, not control. Autonomy. Driving home that night, I realized something important. They called me a failure, but failure would have reacted emotionally. Failure would have exploded. Failure would have demanded validation. I did none of that. I read the fine print. I waited. I enforced. And when the moment came, I chose permanence over pride. Months later, the company's valuation recovered. The structure held. The family remained intact. But under new gravity, mine, and the most devastating part, I never raised my voice. I never begged. I never attacked. I simply allowed consequences to function. My name is Ethan Miller. Clean-shaven. Calm. Patient. They gave my sister $4 million. They called me a failure. And in the end, I became the only one qualified to protect what they almost destroyed. Not because I was louder, but because I was prepared.